start with,
I have a bot.
here we go. We're going to start with the,
I'm ready to take notes.
yeah, here we go. We're going to,
record it.
yeah,
Already in.
she is.
Oh, okay.
We're going to start with the end of Kennedy's presidency and the beginning of Johnson. So, Kennedy, his assassination in 1963 is a very powerful mystique behind it. And after his assassination, you have Lyndon Johnson was the vice president. He assumes the presidency. And in a lot of ways, he was his complete opposite. He was Kennedy's complete opposite. And there's a lot of wisdom in putting a vice president as an opposite. First of all, he was a Southerner. He was from Texas. He had been in the Senate for a very long time and had a tremendous amount of political experience. Once he was president, the name of his overarching program was the Great Society. And he starts out with war on poverty. And his war on poverty overshadows everything, even civil rights advances. And he does so because Johnson was raised in a very poor area in Texas, and his family saw a lot of suffering, and he saw a lot of suffering in his area.
So like when you say shine over, do you mean like?
It overshadowed everything. Like it was predominant. Okay, so it took precedent. Okay, it took #1 seat.
Okay.
Johnson suffered as a child?
Well, I mean, he grew up poor, and those around him did as well. They all had to work very, very hard, as opposed to the Kennedys, who had.
Oh wait, Johnson grew up poor?
Yes, as opposed to the Kennedys, who had summer homes and
Like JFK?
yeah, yeah.
I love that airport.
Oh yeah. Yeah, Johnson doesn't have an
He was
airport.
fine. Wasn't Kennedy supposed to be one of like the best presidents?
Yeah.
Yeah, he was good one.
How long does it think it lasts? I might be able to like comment a little bit. Sorry, but.
We're recording. Oh, it won't last very long. 45 minutes max.
Oh really? And where is it?
At the gym. We're recording the review. So this war on poverty, it has a lot of programs that are designed to help a lot of disadvantaged, and one of them is free nursery schools. And they're designed to do things like offer preschools and kindergartens. It's called Head Start. Where we still have Head Start. When I was a little girl, I went to kindergarten. My parents paid for kindergarten.
I thought it's like a normal thing now.
It's a normal thing now. But kindergarten was not publicly funded when I was a little girl.
That's sad. Like I feel bad for you.
I don't, because I seem to be doing okay. But it wasn't a normal thing back then, okay? He also, so Johnson's Great Society has a lot in common with FDR's New Deal.
Yeah.
And it's no coincidence, because that is exactly where Johnson got his political legs from, okay? That's where he got his experience. He grew up at a time when he benefited from the 30s and 40s from the New Deal. The 1964 election is when Johnson goes and campaigns on his own, and he's up against Barry Goldwater. Barry Goldwater emphasizes small government, and his approach is very alienating because his approach to foreign policy is bizarre. He's also very much opposed to civil rights.
Isn't that what Lyndon B. Johnson wanted?
Yes. So Barry Goldwater, his approach to foreign policy is very, very different than Lyndon B. Johnson's. So in the '64 presidential election, Johnson wins by a landslide. And when any president wins by a landslide, it gives them a mandate. And what a mandate means is it gives them a license to really promote their agenda, to really get their legislation pushed through Congress. That means that they have the people's backing to do what they are elected to do. He's able to get environmental reforms pushed through, helping clean up the air and water. He also establishes the National Endowment for Humanities that recognizes excellence in theater, arts, entertainment, music,
National Endowment for what?
humanities. He passes the Elementary and Secondary Education Act.
What was that?
Elementary and Secondary Education Act. This gives federal funds to states to train teachers so that they can be effective educators in primary and secondary schools. And he also gets the passage of the Immigration Act of 1965. This 1965 Immigration Act takes away any kind of discrimination. Because in 1920, there was a lot of discrimination. They had passed a very discriminatory quota act in 1920s. And they would limit how many people could come from different countries. And in 1965, they abolished it. So this Great Society program, the lasting outcomes is that the elderly, the very poor and marginalized, for the very first time, get much greater access to health care, to benefits like education. And it really does make a lasting impact on their lives. Feminism starts in the 50s, and it starts with women in trade unions.
Women what?
In trade unions.
In what year?
Starts in the 50s.
What are trade unions?
Trade unions like workers' unions. think like those triangle shirtwaist factories and, yeah, things like that. So by 1963, the president orders a special commission to investigate discriminatory practices in employment and in education, the status of women. And what they find out is shocking. That women that are working the exact same jobs as men are getting paid less. That women that are professors at colleges and universities are denied tenure, denied promotions, and that are not getting paid equally. That in the workplace and education, they are documenting actual discrimination. Before, it was just what people thought and assumed, but now they're able to actually document it.
Okay, I thought people said that Johnson wasn't like a good president. Wasn't.
Depending on who you listen to. I mean, some people say Trump is a good president. Some people say he isn't. Some people say Obama is or wasn't. I mean, you know, it depends on which side of the political spectrum you are. Okay?
So women in workplace and education are
They can document the discrimination. The one thing you really need to know about in Johnson's administration is what a burden the war in Vietnam was on him and on his programs like the Great Society. Please look up the Gulf of Tonkin, Tonkin, the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution, Tonkin. The Gulf of Tonkin Resolution, basically it gave the president unlimited authority in conducting the Vietnam War.
Unlimited what?
Unlimited authority in conducting the war in Vietnam.
Why would they put somebody who has, or well, why would they replace someone who's been doing that the whole, like, career?
Well, the Vietnam War is, before it was like, it went through 4 administrations. And it was like, we weren't necessarily a declared war. We sent peacekeeping troops, we sent military advisors, so now it's an outright war. So, yeah.
What years were the Vietnam?
Started in the 50s and ended in 74 and 5.
When my mom was born.
74.
Yeah.
So there were lots and lots of violent anti-war protests. And there's also Operation Rolling Thunder. Operation Rolling Thunder. This intensified, this is in 1965. It intensifies the war. The North Vietnamese, and it hardens their will to fight even more.
It hurts the Vietnamese.
It intensifies the North, so the Vietnam War is between the North and the South Vietnamese. We were supporting the South Vietnamese. The North Vietnamese were communist.
Right.
And the Operation Rolling Thunder is the North Vietnamese intensifies their will to fight.
Okay.
Economically, the money that we were putting into this war actually creates an inflation in the United States in 1968. This inflationary start in 1968 only gets worse in the next decade.
What causes the inflammation?
The money that we're spending on the war.
Oh,
So by 1978, we're in very bad economic times.
You said 19 what?
68 to 78, yeah.
so like a recession?
Oh yeah,
Or-
oh yeah, it's definitely a recession. You have lots of protests. You have a group called Young Americans for Freedom, which is a large student group in the 1960s that protest against middle class and authority and the counterculture. Bet y'all can remember that, right? Boom. Boom, that's why I did that. Lyndon B. Johnson's administration is really burdened by the Vietnam War. His Great Society, his war on poverty, his domestic policies were very well intentioned, and he could push anything through Congress. He was a manipulator and master of the Senate. But Vietnam was a real big burden. And
Like everyone blamed him for it?
absolutely. And because of that, it undermined his commitment to these domestic programs. Vietnam was always the big white elephant in the room. Like, he couldn't get a lot of his domestic things pushed through because of Vietnam. So, and 68 was a particularly bloody year in Vietnam. You had the Tet Offensive, and that's also when Americans changed their view of the war. They believe that the war is unwinnable.
The Americans were?
Yes. That we've lost focus, that this is not a war that America should be in anymore. And because Johnson had assumed the vice presidency upon Kennedy's death, he only ran for office one time, which meant in 1968, he was able, according to the Constitution, to run for office again in 1968.
Oh, this person.
He did not. In 1968, he shocked the country by declining to run again. So Robert Kennedy decides that he's going to throw his hat into the ring for the Democratic Party, Robert F. Kennedy. But what happens to that Kennedy?
He gets shot.
He probably knows.
He gets
He
assassinated.
got shot in a hotel kitchen.
Yep, in a hotel kitchen, yep,
People
Wait,
against
there's a
these
video of
people.
it. Wait, so Robert?
yeah.
So-
He got shot by,
Did they ever get caught?
yeah, he got shot right, yeah, he got
He got
immediately shot.
shot like he could have back of the head.
Yeah.
Wait, so Robert Kennedy was already elected, or was he
No,
just?
he was running.
No, he just
was
announced his
running?
candidacy, he was
He
running, yeah.
literally was
Okay.
walking back from.
Yeah, he was like, almost like in the garage, like between the kitchen and,
Yeah.
yeah,
My dad and I watched the documentary.
yeah.
It was so sad.
Wait, was
Why
it
is
days
that?
after he just got elected?
He
wasn't
wasn't
elected.
elected. He was in the.
He was a candidate,
He died June 5th, 1968, I think.
68,
Okay.
yeah, he just announced
No,
his
my dad's
candidacy.
obsessed with him.
The other candidate was who ran on a campaign based on segregation was a man named George Wallace. He thought we should go back to black only and white only segregated society. And during the 1968 Democratic Convention, where they choose the nomination, it took place in Chicago, and it was a bloody convention. Protests were everywhere out in the street. Many people were hurt. Some people were killed. It was incredibly violent that summer. And you also have Richard Nixon running. Richard Nixon is running for the Republican ticket. And Richard Nixon runs, and his campaign is that he is going to be the quiet voice for the forgotten Americans. And he comes across as being sort of the voice of reason. Especially because, well, Robert Kennedy is dead, and the other one is a bigot.
So okay.
So needless to say, Nixon is elected.
Is he the one with the Watergate situation?
Yes, ma'am. The women's liberation movement really starts to gain steam in the late 60s throughout the 70s. And this is what we refer to as the new left. The women's rights movement is the new left. All of you are beneficiaries of Title IX. How many of you have heard of Title IX? You all should. Title IX is federally funded for campuses. What is spent on men's sports has to be equally spent on women's sports.
Oh wait, I heard this.
Yep. There's actually a women's clothing called Title IX. And it's because of that. So there are some court decisions as well that go along with that. So make sure you know about the equal credit opportunity in 1974. That helps women, gives women access to credit.
What is it called again?
The Equal Credit Opportunity Act of 1974. Prior to that, women they couldn't walk into a bank and get the same line of credit with the exact same job as a man. Can you believe that?
Yeah. Just 'cause the
And that's like
background,
recent
but-
too.
Yeah.
That's like in the.
That's like crazy.
It's crazy. This is also a time when gay men and women also start to advocate, to start coming out of the closet, advocate for their rights as well. In your book, it talks about the Stonewall riot in New York City.
That was crazy. My sister knows all about that.
Yeah. 1969, the Stonewall riot. The police would routinely go into these, they pretty much were like speakeasies, but they were gay clubs. They just weren't advertised as that. And the police would raid them all the time because it was against the law. There were laws on the books for sodomy. And they would go in there and arrest them.
They would, the women would have to check the men's shoes because the speakeasies were like dirty on the floor. So the women would check their shoes and see if the men were at the bar.
Wait, what?
They
Oh,
would,
that's crazy.
yeah, I mean, they,
Like their husband?
it was totally against the law, yeah. So, what Nixon tapped into was what he called the silent majority. The silent majority are what he called the people who just went to work, paid their bills, didn't protest, regular people. And that's who he tapped into. They weren't radicals on either side. And that's how he won his election. And his main goal was to get out of Vietnam. His strategy was to get out of Vietnam. And by 1969, it was really coming to a head. There were demonstrations at Kent State University where 4 students were killed by National Guardsmen that were protesting. The students were protesting and 4 students were shot and killed by National Guardsmen.
Protesting what?
Protesting the Vietnam War. Because our troops had actually gone into Cambodia.
So they said like 16-year-olds that were going
Yeah.
and stuff, so there's that big.
Yes, yeah. Where Johnson was all about domestic policies, Nixon was all about foreign policies. He was the very first president to engage with communist China and open up their doors. The Supreme Court becomes much more liberal under Earl Warren, the Warren Court. And it stays that way for a while until the 80s.
Wait, what was the guy's name?
Earl Warren. Until you get Rehnquist. In 1972, we're still in Vietnam, and there are the Christmas bombings. And this was the most intense bombings of the war yet. And by then, Americans are absolutely sick and tired of this. And we've seen the Malay massacre.
Can you spell that?
M-Y, another word, L-A-I. The Malay massacre was when American troops, Marines, went into a village and massacred over 500 villagers. They got some intel that the villagers were giving aid and comfort to the Viet Cong, which were the northern Vietnamese.
Okay, so this happened in North.
Were they actually?
So was this, the Americans did this? They killed
So American troops massacred everyone in the village. So we withdraw from Vietnam in 1973 and 1974. Vietnam then falls very quickly as a communist country, an independent communist country. Richard Nixon wins in 1972 in the landslide against George McGovern. And this signals to the country a swing to the right and more conservative. And it's too bad that we don't have enough time to go into Nixon's presidency. Because then we could talk about the Watergate scandal.
That's still insane.
There is a documentary that's on HBO right now called The Plumbers. It's fantastic.
My dad maybe watched the movie The Post,
Uh-huh.
and he also loves All the President's Men.
All the President's Men, yeah.
So I know fairly a lot about it.
Speaking of bumps in my
So ladies, please make sure that you read that PowerPoint that's posted.